This is part 3 of the 4-part series, Creating the Restaurant Guide. In part 1, we took a Photoshop file and we imported it into 3 different products: Flash, Flash Catalyst, and InDesign. In this part, we're going to focus on using Flash Catalyst to create our restaurant guide. Now, I mentioned Flash Catalyst is kind of meant to bridge the gap between the non-programmers and the programmers. It gave us the ability to take our Photoshop file, import it, and see all the layers that we had in Photoshop and begin working with them in an interactive way. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to group some content. Flash Catalyst doesn't like when you have a ton of assets kind of just littered about on the stage. And you'll notice each of these layer folders has a whole bunch of layers inside of it. Well, content 1, which is going to be the content that shows when I click the first button, is going to all be faded in. So I'm going to click on this layer group, and this heads-up display, often referred to as the HUD, I'm going to choose a component to convert it to, and I'm going to convert this to a generic component. You Photoshop and Illustrator people, think of this as a group, and now this content has been grouped. That's why it's a great practice to use layer folders. I'm going to do this for the remaining 3 pieces of content. I've now converted all 4 of my content objects to custom components. I'm going to hide them. Now, same is true with my buttons. These 4 items are going to become buttons. So I'm going to click on each layer group, and I'm going to convert this to a component, although I'm going to choose button as the component. I'm going to do this again for panel 2. Click, choose to be a button. Panel 3, choose to be a button, and panel 4, choose to be a button. Now, you Flash people, if I were to use a Flash vernacular, I'm converting these to symbols. At any time, I can test my movie. Test movie is done the exact same way it is in Flash. Control Enter or Command Enter. You can also go to the File menu and choose Run Project. Now, every time you test movie, it's going to actually preview this in a web browser, but it's pretty much the same process. I have 4 buttons. Notice I'm not getting any rollover with these buttons. Well, I'm going to go back to Flash Catalyst. I'm going to click on the button. I'm going to go to the Properties panel, and I'm going to scroll down and tell this button to use the hand cursor. This tells it to show that kind of active cursor on rollover. I can do the same thing for the other 3 buttons. All right, I've got my buttons created. It's time now to set up my different pages. I'm going to create separate pages up above here. We tend to refer to these as states in Flash Catalyst. So I'm going to duplicate this state. It's going to make a second state called page 2, and I'm going to show the content that I want to show up on page 2. Now, page 2 is going to be content 1, so I better do a better job of renaming these. I'm going to double click on page 1. I'm going to call this menu. I'm going to double click on page 2. I'm going to call it content 1. Although I can't use spaces in the state name. Now I'm going to keep going. I'm going to go and create a duplicate state. This is going to be called content 2. I'm going to hide the content 1 state, and I'm going to show the content 2 state. I'm going to continue this process for the other 2 pieces of content. I now have 5 total states: a menu state, content 1, which is showing content 1, content 2, content 3, and content 4. I want to wire up my 4 buttons to take me to these 4 states. This is where the non-programmers start to cringe because they get the feeling they gotta write some action script. No worries here. We are not allowed to write code in Flash Catalyst. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my menu state. I'm going to click on the first button. I'm going to open my interactions panel. I'm going to add an interaction. On click, I'm going to play a transition to state, which is just a fancy way of saying go to a state. I want this button to go to content 1, that state. And that's going to happen whenever it's clicked, when in any state. I'm going to click OK. I'm going to go to the second button and do the same thing. Add an interaction. Play transition to state, you're going to go to content 2. I'll finish this for the last two buttons. I now have all four buttons on click going to the appropriate state. I'm going to save my file and I'm going to hit Control Enter to test my movie. As my file runs, you'll notice the hand cursor is showing up as I mouse over my individual buttons, and as I click, it goes to the appropriate state. No transition yet, but I want to make this so I can go back to the menu. And I'm going to go back to the menu just by clicking on the content. There's a little X up here. I'm not going to make that a button. I'm just going to say if they click anywhere, it takes them back. So let's go back to Flash Catalyst. Let's go to Content 1. What I'm going to do is click on the content, and I'm just going to add an interaction to that. I'm going to tell this that on click, I want you to go back to the menu state. I'm going to click OK. I'm going to repeat this process for my three other states. Click on the state, select the content, add an interaction on click. Let's go back to the menu state. I now have all four pieces of content configured that when I click them, I go back to the menu state. I'm going to hit Control Enter or Command Enter, run my application, click on the first button, select it goes away. Click on the third, click it goes away. This is nice, sort of master detail functionality. But you know what? This isn't sexy. We need some transitions. We need some motion going on here. I want to have some animation. And that's another thing that Flash Catalyst does really intuitively. It sort of looks at what happens between the states and will add in its own animation. So let's go back to the menu state. When I click on any of these buttons, it's going to take me to that appropriate state. So when I click on the first button, I'm going to go to Content 1. I'm going to hide my pages for a second, and I'm going to expand the timeline down at the bottom. Notice this is showing me all the different possible transitions, and there's a whole bunch here because I have 5 states, so it's showing me the transition from menu to content 1, menu to content 2, menu to content 3, and then it's showing me content 1 to menu, it's showing me every single possibility going from this state to this state, this state to this state. Now I don't have that many possibilities. I really only have menu to the 4 different states and those individual states back to menu. So I'm going to start with menu going to content 1. What's the difference? The only difference is that my content is hidden in the menu state and it's showing in the content 1 state. So that warrants a fade in. So all I'm going to do is hit the smooth transition button, and this is going to give me a fade. I can hit the play button to preview it, and it's going to show that content fading in. Done. That's all it takes. Run your movie. I'm going to click on my content and you see it fade in. I click, it goes away. Simple as that. No keyframes, no motion tweens or anything. I can always add in my own transitions by selecting the content and adding an actual action to it. Now I'm going to repeat this process. Menu to content 2, smooth transition. Menu to content 3, smooth transition. Menu to content 4, smooth transition. I also want it to work when going back to menu. So I'm going to find where each piece of content is going back to the menu, and I'm going to do a smooth transition there too. This is going to fade out the content, which is actually an extra thing that we didn't do in the Flash version. That would have been a little bit more complicated. I'm not going to worry about any of the other transitions because you can't go between the different pieces of content. So I'm just going to find where each piece of content goes back to the menu, select it, and do a smooth transition. Again, I could be adding in additional animations if I want. We're not going to focus on that in this tutorial. Now that I have them all done, I run my movie and click on an item, it fades in, I click, it goes away. I have a nice looking master detail file here that's animating content in. So the final piece of this is I want to make my buttons look a little bit more like buttons. I'm going to show my states and I'm going to go back to the menu. I'm going to hide the timeline for right now. I want this button to actually animate that overstate. I worked so hard in my Photoshop file to add this overstate. I want it to show up and I want it to fade in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to either double click on the button, or you'll notice the HUD or heads up display is telling me, hey, do you want to edit your button's appearance? Well, yeah, I want to actually add an overstate. So I'm going to click on that over button. As I said, either way, it's like double clicking your button. You'll notice the same states that you would get if you were in Flash. Well, on the overstate, I'm going to find my layers. I'm going to expand this, and I'm going to look at my over layer, and I'm going to show it. Now, I want that to show here. Well, that is all it takes, is showing that layer on the overstate will give us the functionality of having content show up when we mouse over. You'll see as I mouse over this button that content shows up. Well, I want to fade that content in. That's where the timeline comes into play. Notice all those animation transitions are in here again, from the up to the overstate. Well, I'm going to do another smooth transition. Again, I could add in some custom modifications here. I'm just doing this kind of out of the box with Flash Catalyst. When I'm going from the overstate back to the upstate, I'm going to smooth transition as well. Now, just so it looks good, on mouse down, I'm going to also show this content. I'm going to test my movie. When it pops up, you'll notice when I roll over it, it fades in. When I roll out, it fades out. If I click, it doesn't go away because I showed it in the down state, and I get the content showing up. I'm going to add the same functionality to my other 3 buttons by going back to the main level, the top level, the restaurant level, double clicking on a button, and doing the same transition on the overstate. I've now added rollovers to all 4 buttons, and if I mouse over any of these, I see a really smooth transition. I can click on any of them and see the content for that specific restaurant. Flash Catalyst allowed me to make this pretty quickly. I didn't have to write a single line of code. I didn't have to mess with keyframes in the timeline. It was a pretty intuitive development process. Now, the second I want to add in some data or make this a little bit more dynamic, maybe coming from a database, or have some really customized animations that are moving in a real non-linear, or maybe like following a motion path, I have to go to Flash for that. But Flash Catalyst, I kind of tell people, does 85% of what you want to do, and most of the time that's all you need. So this example showed how to add interactive content with Flash Catalyst.